It's very good to be in a location like this. I always get nervous when I realize that half of you may be looking at me on the big screens behind. And many times when I've been doing this, I get this sort of sense, I wonder what I look like on that screen. The trouble is, if you try to see, then it's one of those postmodern moments. All you see when you look to see what you look like is the back of your own head. I have a feeling Jacques Derrida may have said something about that. I'm not sure. Anyway, we're talking about Paul this week. When as a bishop, I take upon myself to talk about Paul, I'm always reminded of the bishop, I can't remember which one it was, who said plaintively, everywhere St. Paul went, there was a riot. Everywhere I go, they serve tea. And we might ask ourselves, what have we done to domesticate Paul to avoid the riots and sip the tea instead? What has happened to the explosive, dramatic Pauline gospel if studying it now becomes a leisure activity for those who like that kind of thing, to be fitted in between going for a jog and watching our favorite TV program? What was it in the first place that made Paul say what he said and made what he said the focus of so much anger and fear and produced so many riots and beatings and stonings and all the rest of it? Now, Paul knew none better that his gospel was bound to be seen as dangerous nonsense. We need to remind ourselves of that from time to time, because those of us who grew up in the church and those of us who've known and loved the gospel and have worshipped together for a long time often take it for granted that this is a fairly sensible thing to believe because it's what we've ordered our lives by. But it hits you in the face when you think what it was like for Paul arriving in Philippi or Thessalonica or Corinth or wherever it was. I was reminded of this a few years ago when I was at a conference, an SBL conference in Atlanta in Georgia, about, I think, 10 or 12 years ago. I was staying in a nice hotel, but away on the other side of the world, the England rugby team was playing in the final of the World Cup, playing against Australia in Australia. Now, you may not know this, but there is nothing that Australian sports people like better than beating England. And England had made it to the final against some fierce and stiff opposition, finally to confront the hosts on their own turf. For some reason, none of the television channels in my hotel were showing this match. Not quite sure why that was. So I phoned my daughter back in England, knowing she would be glued to the television. And she was ecstatic because England's rugby poster boy, Johnny Wilkinson, had won the game and the cup for England with a drop goal in the final minute of the game. Australia was crestfallen. England was ecstatic. I was ecstatic. And when you have good news like that, you want to share it. So I went out into the hotel lobby. It was about 6 in the morning, and the only people around were the concierge and some hall porters. I wanted to rush up to them and say, "Did you hear the news? England just won the cup." I wanted to hug the reception clerk and celebrate. And I realized these people probably don't even know that there was a game being played. They probably don't even know what rugby is. You might as well go out on the street in Pasadena and tell the passers-by that Zambia had beaten Zimbabwe at table tennis. You know, it may be good news to you, but it's nonsense to them. It makes no sense at all. Then came the crowning irony. As the day woke up and the conference participants began to arrive for breakfast, I looked around for anyone who knew about the game. And you may have guessed it, the first person I met who knew about the game was an Australian. So there I was with wonderful, life-changing news, and it was foolishness to the Americans and a scandal to the Australians. But for us who believed, it made us happy for a week. There are lots of boys playing rugby today because when they were little, they saw that match and they wanted to be Johnny Wilkinson when they grew up. Now, those of us who grew up knowing about the Christian faith, as I say, may need reminding that this was what it was like when Paul arrived in a new town. The world has a new Lord and he's called Jesus. What are you talking about? He was crucified. Excuse me, but God raised him from the dead. Oh, for goodness sake, give us a break. You must be crazy. Now he's in charge of the whole world and he's wanting us to join in with what he's doing in his new way of life. Every line in that announcement is either nonsense or it's scandalous or both. And when it becomes clear that for Paul, this message will mean giving up some of the major symbols of your own world, particularly your regular trips to the various temples for festivals, for fun of various sorts, and for prayer in time of distress, in order to make sure that the city and the community are protected against possible dangers. You're going to have to give up all of that because those aren't gods there, they're non-gods, and they're bad for your health. Don't go near them. There's a new way of worshipping, a new way. But what are the neighbors going to think? This is dangerous nonsense. What will the authorities think? Might this be bad for business? In Philippi or Ephesus, at least, the answer was yes. This was bad for business. For all those reasons, people got worried and riots were likely. Oh, we don't want this kind of disruptive thing here, thank you very much. Folly to Gentiles, scandalous to Jews. But, as Paul says in various places, to us, the gospel, the good news about Jesus, about a living God who has acted in Jesus, about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus as the turning point of history, the place where heaven and earth come together and do business at last, the place where the old world was condemned and the new world was born. This message carried its own power and, surprisingly, its own new wisdom. It generated a new way of thinking, a new way of knowing, and that power and that wisdom reached out. And even though people, when they first heard it, thought this is absolutely crazy, some people found that it went right deep down inside them and transformed them from top to bottom. And with that transformation, something new came into existence. Not just a new spirituality for individuals, no, a new community, a new way of life, a way of life radically different from anything any of them had known before. From the very beginning, Christianity wasn't an individual sport like table tennis. It was a team sport like rugby. You can't do reconciliation all by yourself. And that's what the gospel was about. It made, quite simply, a world of difference. You can see that world of difference in one small but significant moment in Paul's life. And this is where I start the book, Paul and the Faithfulness of God. During one of Paul's imprisonments, I'm pretty sure it was when he was in Ephesus, though that could be debated, a young man in trouble came to find him, a slave, Onesimus, who had run away from his master Philemon in a town a day or two's journey up the Lycus Valley. Paul hadn't been to that town, Colossae, but Philemon, Onesimus, his master, seems to have been probably to Ephesus and had met Paul, heard him preach, and he was one of those who had been transformed by the gospel, turned inside out. Philemon had gone back home to Colossae as a Christian. But life is never simple. The gospel produces complications as well as transformations. By the way, in case you're wondering, slavery in the ancient world, this is a sidebar, but quite an important one. Slavery in the ancient world was quite different from the slavery we've known in Western culture in the early modern period, and which, tragically, we are now seeing again in new forms in parts of the world. Slavery, of course, always involved treating human beings as things, as objects. And for Christians and Jews alike, the foundation story included the story of the Exodus, in which the God who made the world is revealed as the God who sets slaves free. Make no mistake about it. But in the ancient world, be clear about this, slavery had nothing to do with ethnicity or the color of your skin. Anyone could become a slave. All you had to do was lose a battle or perhaps go bankrupt. So although the institution always was dehumanizing, it was a different kind of thing to what the word says to us today. And often slaves could get free, either buy their freedom or be given their freedom, and resume a perfectly ordinary life. So it was a much more complicated thing than we think. And we've got to remind ourselves as well that in the ancient world, slavery was how things got done. It was the equivalent of electricity, gasoline, atomic power, and all the other things that we get today to work for us. And the idea of suddenly banning slavery, which we kind of want to say to Paul, you should have done that, that was no more thinkable than it would be for me to tell you here tonight in Los Angeles that you should right now give up driving your car, leave it in the parking lot, get home some other way, And you should also, by the way, give up using electricity when you get back home. That's off limits now. If you want to grumble at Paul for not telling Philemon to free all his slaves at once, then think again. Socially, culturally, that's where they were at. But what Paul does, end of sidebar, is something much more subtle, much more indicative of the new birth which had come with Jesus the Messiah. We tend to go for the grand gesture. We love grand gestures in the Western world particularly. Go on, Paul, we want to say. Tell him slavery is wicked. God is going to set them all free. Well, even if that had been possible, it wouldn't in fact have been as difficult as what Paul is asking of Philemon and also of Onesimus. Paul is asking that they be reconciled, not just that they tolerate each other, not just that they forgive one another at a distance, but of course you never need meet again. No, the gospel for runaway slaves is, first, the good news that God loves them so much that Jesus died for them, but it is, second, the news that the reconciliation they have found with the living God is also the reconciliation that must be put into effect with their brothers and sisters. That was hard for Philemon, it was hard for Onesimus, but it was central to the message and mission of Paul the Apostle. You can see this quite clearly if you contrast Paul's letter to Philemon with a letter by a near contemporary of his, Pliny the Younger. We've got a whole collection of Pliny's letters. He was an aristocrat, a lawyer, a politician, a senior civil servant in the imperial bureaucracy. And he had occasion to write to a friend, a social inferior, about a young man in trouble. Not an exact parallel to Philemon and Onesimus, but not too far off either. But when we put the two letters side by side, and this is how I start the book, see, I'm just getting the plug in from time to time, but so you know where we are. When we see them side by side, there are all sorts of subtle differences, which, when we think them through, give us a sharp little spotlight on Paul's gospel and the world of difference it made, and particularly on the question of why there was such a thing as Paul's theology. Why Paul invented something which, with hindsight, we can call Christian theology, and what that new intellectual discipline was designed to do. There isn't time to go into the details on Paul and Pliny. You'll have to look at the book for that. But let's just say that in Pliny's letter, nothing changes socially. Oh, he wants his friend to do the decent thing, to be kind after a fashion. But society is not changed. Everyone keeps their place in the social order. Whereas with Paul, something quite radical has happened. He stretches out one hand and says, here is Onesimus. He is my son, my very heart, my second self. And he stretches out the other hand and says, and you, Philemon, we are partners. We're in this gospel business together. You owe me your own very self anyway. I want a return on that investment. And as Paul in this letter reaches out to both of them, we see that though he doesn't explicitly mention the death of Jesus in this letter, he is enacting the death of Jesus and its reconciling power in his pastoral ministry. It's no surprise after reading Philemon to discover that when Paul describes his own vocation and ministry in 2 Corinthians, he speaks of it as being a ministry of the new covenant in which hearts are changed, 2 Corinthians 3 and 4, a ministry then of new creation in which nothing remains the same, 2 Corinthians 5, and above all, end of 2 Corinthians 5, the ministry of reconciliation. In a sense, it would have been much easier for Paul to tell Philemon, oh, by the way, I met that slave of yours, Onesimus, but he's gone away and I don't know where he is now. And Paul could have said to Onesimus, look, just push off, go off to Philippi. There's some nice people there. You need never come back here and then it'll be all much easier. No, that's not how the gospel demand works. The good news of God in the Messiah reconciling the cosmos to himself catches up all those who believe it in the imperative to work for reconciliation at every level. The gospel is good news for runaway slaves, but as with the rest of us, the good news which transforms us makes us, for precisely that reason, stand up straight and take responsibility for living out the gospel of reconciliation in a new way, in a new world, in the new world that God has launched in the Messiah. So the gospel generates a new community, precisely because it is about the generous outflowing love of God in the death of Jesus. It cannot be a message for or about isolated individuals. The ancient world knew a lot about the theory of character formation. Last time I was here at Fuller, I gave a lecture, I seem to recall, on virtue. That book was supposed to be, the book that it turned into was supposed to be called Virtue Reborn. My American publisher said we can't call it Virtue Reborn because we want to sell this book in Barnes & Noble, and Americans don't buy books with the word virtue in the title. I thought, okay, right, you know best. So he called the book After You Believe. In other words, now that you have come to faith, now that you have believed, you've said a prayer or whatever, what you're going to do between then and finally when you die and whatever happens after that. As my publisher said, this book is about the embarrassing interval between the baptism and the funeral. It's a nice, nice line, that. In England, the phrase after you believe doesn't mean that. I have a good friend who lost his faith and who saw the American edition on a table when he was visiting us, and he said wistfully, after you believe, I guess that's for me. And I thought, no, it isn't actually, sorry, it was an embarrassing moment. Which book do I give him if he wants a book, whatever. But anyway, the point I'm making is that the New Testament picks up on the notion of character development, but it doesn't happen in terms of what Plato or Aristotle would have seen, which is that virtue is something you work on by yourself and for yourself. Christian virtue is equally about character development, but it begins with the sovereign grace of God in the gospel, hence virtue reborn, and it goes to work precisely as a team sport. The greatest of these is love, says Paul. And you can't do love all by yourself. The gospel is all about the new world which was born through the death and resurrection of Jesus and which goes to work through the gospel and the Spirit. And as we ponder that new world, that new way of life, which Paul believed the living God was generating and sustaining in these new communities, we become aware of a particular problem, a particular challenge. The central argument that I have made in my recent big book on Paul is all about how Paul developed a strategy to cope with that problem, how he met that challenge with one of the greatest intellectual and spiritual achievements of that age or any age. Let me put it as simply as I can. Paul knew that a community of reconciliation called into being by the gospel of Jesus the Messiah would be a fragile and brittle thing. All kinds of social and cultural and personal pressures would come upon it, and it would fall into 1,000 fragments. Paul knew in particular that the personal demands of the gospel, demands for love and reconciliation and holiness and transformation of life, that would prove far too much for any community. The strict, tight Jewish community from which he had come had its own ways of meeting the equivalent challenges. They had their cultural markers in place. They knew where they were, focused on the temple in Jerusalem. Even in the diaspora away from Jerusalem, they told the great stories which were echoing the festivals which were taking place in Jerusalem. These stories reminded them of who they were. They circumcised their baby boys as a sign of the covenant so that the very act of generation would be marked by loyalty to the one God. They married within their own people. They kept the strict food laws which marked them out from their pagan neighbors. They had an official exemption from pagan religion, and since in that world religion and society were completely intertwined, they kept apart mostly from the wider world. Okay, there's all sorts of varieties of Judaism, but for Paul, from his strict background, this is how it worked. Holiness is never easy, but it's easier if you live in a community like that, where everything is demarcated. Likewise, unity is never easy. As I say, there were many different Jewish factions and parties at the time, often with sharp dissension between them. But again, it's a lot easier if you've got those cultural markers to fence you off. That they saw as the job of Israel's law, the Torah, and it did it reasonably effectively. But Paul had glimpsed in the gospel The fact that Israel's God had now done a radically new thing. Nobody had expected a crucified Messiah. Nobody had expected that resurrection was something that would happen to one person in advance of all the others. Nobody in particular had imagined that when the old prophecies were fulfilled and Abraham's family was suddenly extended to a worldwide gathering from every nation under heaven, that such people would not have to become Jews as well. After all, if they were going to give up worshipping idols and serve a living God, how else could they do it? Of course they must become Jews. So the central argument of my book, and the one I invite you to consider with me in these days together, is that Paul's worldview, which had this new community of reconciliation at its heart, needed something new, something different, something which would sustain and enhance the life of unity and holiness to which he knew the gospel had called people. And my proposal, which I think quite radically reshapes the way we think about Paul and his ideas, is that Paul effectively invented not just some new theological dogmas, but a new discipline, a task, an activity, which we might with hindsight call Christian theology. Of course, he didn't call it that, but looking back, we can see that's where it began. This discipline was not simply about working out the different dogmas and teaching them to people and showing how they fitted together. It was about teaching people to think in a new way, so that this new thinking as an activity, as well as its new content, would sustain them in the life of unity and holiness to which they were called. And as I'm saying these words in the context of a great seminary from today's church, it seems to me appropriate that we should remind ourselves that theology is not just something you learn as a subject, nor is it just something for the elite core of Christian intellectuals to have fun with as they write books and attend seminars. Christian theology, in the sense I'm meaning it, is a task for the whole church. You know the saying, give someone a fish and you feed them for a day, teach someone to fish and you feed them for life. For Paul, it was like that with theology. Teach someone a doctrine and you may keep them sound for a day. Teach the whole church to think into God's new world, and you will establish the church as the united and holy community bringing glory to God. That is the challenge of Pauline theology. You see it in obvious passages such as the beginning of Romans 12. The first direct result of the gospel is always worship. The worship of the true God by the whole self. Present your bodies, that's your entire self, to God as a living sacrifice. The community is first and foremost the worshipping community. As we'll see, the primal sin for Paul, as for all Jews, is idolatry, and the primal act of grateful obedience is always the true worship of the true God. But for this to happen, the whole person has to be reoriented, and that means the mind. And so in Romans 12:2, he gives us a mandate which could stand as a rubric at the head of all his developed teaching. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, so that you may discern and work out in practice what God's will is. There is Paul's agenda in a nutshell. A new world has been born, and you need new kinds of thinking, the transformation of the mind, in order not only to grasp what it is that's happened, but to see what it is that you must now do to live it out. A little letter like Philemon is in itself an exercise in the transformation of the mind. Philemon is not only to act differently, Paul is getting him to think differently. And the same goes for Onesimus as well. The gospel is good news for runaway slaves and everybody else, not just because it says that the true God is the God of the Exodus, the slave-freeing God, but because it teaches masters and slaves alike new ways of thinking, which are designed not to produce pretty patterns of ideas for their own sake, but as Paul says here in Romans 12, new ways of life. Notice how thinking stands there between worship and action. That is Paul's vision. Lots of churches that do worship, fine. Sometimes they're a little light on the thinking and action. Lots of churches that do action, fine. Sometimes a little light on the worship and the thinking. There are some theologians who do thinking and a bit light on worship and action. Paul's vision has them all together. And when we study his theology, as this week we're trying to do, we are therefore studying not only a set of topics, but a new way of knowing. Because theology as a task, or even as a set of topics, hardly existed in Paul's day. The Jewish people didn't and still don't do theology in the way that became characteristic in the church. Israel's God had revealed himself in the Torah, and what was required was grateful obedience. Didn't have too much to work out. Nor did the pagan thinkers get very far in their theology. They talked about theology, theologia. You find that word in Plato and Aristotle. But it's simply a sub-branch of the study of the whole world, of physics, of that which is. Well, there are the gods as well, so we write a little bit about them. Not that we know too much about them, but we can guess. But here's the point. Neither for the Jews nor for the ancient pagans did the fresh consideration of who God actually was and what he was doing play any such role as that activity came to play for Paul. For Paul, theology, both as task and as content, was load-bearing in a way it had never been before. If that sounds strange, if in our modern Western churches theology has become a hobby for the speculative intellect rather than a household activity for the community of reconciliation, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that we then find unity and holiness so apparently impossible. In 1 Corinthians 14, Paul tells the church to be little babies when it comes to evil, simply not to know about all the horrible things that go on in the world, but in your thinking to be grown up, to be mature. Our contemporary world, like his, does its best to force us the other way, regaling us in the media with all the sordid details, but stopping us thinking in the new way that goes with God's new world. Paul clearly regards this maturity in thinking, which, by the way, is a major topic in the letter to Philippians, we'll come back to that tomorrow, as something for everyone. This isn't about university degrees or an intellectual elite. One of my favorite memories from my years in Durham came from a course that we ran for ordinary parishioners. There are no ordinary parishioners, but you know what I mean. A sort of theology 101 for people who had no formal theological education and in some cases very little formal education of any sort. I remember one old lady well into her 70s who spoke to me after I had handed out the certificates at the end of the course one year. It's a nice course, a bit of Bible, a bit of doctrine, a bit of church history, very basic stuff. And she said to me, you know, Bishop, I've discovered that once you get into this stuff, you'll never be bored again as long as you live. And her face was shining, the lady in her 70s. Christian theology, as conceived by Paul, is load-bearing for the united and holy community in the Messiah. It is for everyone, from runaway slaves to civic officials, from intellectual snobs to illiterate peasants. It is the activity of minds that are being transformed by the gospel, with that thinking taking its proper human maturing place between worship and action. It is indeed foolishness to the Greeks, scandalous to the Jews, but to those who are being saved, both Jew and Greek, it is the power of God and the wisdom of God.